The war we thought will be over in a week has crossed an entire year. Hi, hope you're all doing well. So, 24th February last week marked 1 year since the war in Ukraine began. One of the most watched responses to the war has been that of Xi Jinping's China. The war's anniversary coincided with a flurry of diplomatic maneuvers in Europe, most notably the Munich Security Conference in Germany. Now, at Munich, all attention was stuck on US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who gravely stated that China could supply lethal help, that is, weapons to Russia, a claim that Beijing denies. This statement triggered a series of assorted responses from the strategic community the world over, and opinion pieces on decoding Blinken's statement started to flow. But what is China's actual plan? Before coming to China's overtures, a dramatic set of events followed in the build-up to the first anniversary of the war that once again underscores just how geopolitical fault lines are deepening. So, just as the Munich Security Conference concluded, US President Joe Biden unexpectedly visited Kyiv. Amid wailing air sirens, he reaffirmed the US's commitment to helping Ukraine in a pitch-perfect speech. But that's not all. A day later, Russian President Vladimir Putin addressed Russia's National Assembly, once again saber-rattling nuclear escalation by suspending the New START, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty with the US. A few hours later, he was pictured with top Chinese diplomat Wang Yi in an unusually proximate setting in the Kremlin. And those of you who have seen the longest table in the world on which he meets world leaders, the setting for Wang was truly an exception. Wang had gone to Moscow as the final stop in his recent Europe tour, where he visited Paris, Rome, Munich, Budapest, and finally Moscow. So these two images, Biden with Zelensky and Wang with Putin, sum up the bifurcated geopolitical solidarities on the first anniversary of the war, which shows no signs of abating in its second year either. Wang's timing was unmissable and has amplified the gravity of Blinken's statement on Beijing's alleged plans. Now, it has been perceived with caution by an assiduously neutral New Delhi as well. Understandably for India, China's role in the Ukraine conflict and its support or lack thereof to Russia is a major factor of how New Delhi gauges its own ties with Moscow. The reason is quite simple. India is assessing the efficacy of its ties with Russia in managing the regional order around the rise of China and our unsettled border at LAC. A weakened Russia getting too close to China would defeat India's strategic calculus. But what is the significance of China's rather ill-timed wooing of Europe through this tour? So, Chinese diplomat Wang Yi had been sent on a tour to Europe to mend China's broken ties with the bloc and for the necessary groundwork for French President Emmanuel Macron's and Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni's upcoming visits to Beijing. Actually, China's ties with Europe are far from steady despite humongous trade volumes. The ambitious trade and investment deal has been stuck for many years now over human rights concerns. China has been blocked out of the EU on sensitive technologies such as the 5G. Beijing's coercive economic statecraft has been met with a diffident EU-wide anti-coercion instrument following an ugly spat between Lithuania and China over Taiwan. Chinese Confucius institutes are also eyed with mistrust almost all over Europe, barring, of course, the only exception, Hungary under Viktor Orban. So China's refusal to condemn Russia's actions in Ukraine and endorsing the Russian narrative of victimization against Western aggression has only added to further fraying of ties. The EU is not a partner that China can afford to remain complacent about, especially as the latter's ties with the US have hit an all-time low. I'm sure you must have seen the latest US-China spat over the spy balloons. But coming back to China and Europe, in a noticeable shift from an erstwhile wolf warrior stance, there has been a resumption of talks on the human rights front, which is a good example of China's efforts to court the EU. But Wang Yi's refusal to condemn Russia's actions in Ukraine and failing to grasp Europe's security concerns struck the wrong chords at Munich. In the backdrop of a protracted war in Ukraine, with transatlantic solidarity running high, the seasoned Chinese diplomat seems to have misread the sanctity of how Russia's war has united opinions, actors, and statecraft across the Atlantic. Now, this is straining Beijing's duplicitous posturing on Russia. On the one hand is China's official neutral stand and refusal, at least so far, to send military aid to Russia. And this China does for the sake of safeguarding its own economic interests. But on the other hand is the maneuvering to save Russia from a likely defeat, if any. Russia is the only potent enough power in Beijing's plan of an alternate world order that is capable of calling global shots. The others, take a guess, North Korea, Cambodia, Iran, and to some extent Pakistan too, are all pariahs in their own ways. From China's perspective then, it is optimal that Russia remains a junior partner, a second fiddle to Beijing's aspirations. But a Russia that is defeated and weakened is not of much use to China's covert ambitions of dominating the world. So how exactly can then China help Russia? China can help Russia in broadly three ways, apart from the massive imports of heavily discounted Russian crude oil. One, it could send munition and military aid at the cost of triggering secondary sanctions on itself. As both sides of the war are in dire need of ammunition, China could choose to cross the red line and send military aid to its friend with no limits. But the costs of this in terms of secondary sanctions are going to be disproportionately high for Beijing. Reason, again, is purely trade volumes. I'll tell you how. Beijing's total trade with Russia stands at $157 billion merely, even after all the massive oil imports. By contrast, China's trade with the US stands at $690 billion and with the EU at $575 billion. So a dent there would shake up the Chinese Communist Party, especially when the overstretched COVID restrictions have just been lifted and CCP officials have been welcoming foreign investment at international forums. So by all logic, China would not risk secondary sanctions by crossing those red lines. Two, it could try mediating a peace plan to bring the war to a ceasefire or an end. And it has actually given a 12-point high on rhetoric peace plan. But Chinese credibility is extremely low with Ukraine and the West, and this limits its role as a self-professed mediator. A mediator must have equal credibility with both sides. And three, it could drive a wedge between the pro-China regime in Hungary and the rest of the EU and impede the bloc's capacity to impose further sanctions on Russia. To dilute the stringent impact of already in place sanctions, China could and is helping Russia in circumventing those by quasi-corporate contracts that are difficult to expose. Deng Xiaoping once said in the 70s that China should approach European multipolarity to divide it with the US. In tune with that, China seems to be keen on this third option as Wang decided to skip Brussels and instead used Hungary as the entry point to access Europe. China has also had some success with fueling disruptions in the EU. It is now known that thanks to Hungary, the EU27 could not agree to a blackout on Russia over nuclear energy. Furthermore, a fresh package of anniversary sanctions slated for 24th February could not be agreed upon either. However, the smart Chinese management is unlikely to change the perception that China is actually backing Russia. Additionally, a war in Europe is not in China's economic interest. It must be remembered that economic interests are the fulcrum of China's statecraft and influence in the world today. War brings instability, chaos, economic disruption, and commotion, all of which are unconducive to Chinese business interests and investments in the region. And since China's New Silk Road dream was already getting clobbered in many European countries, the added stress of a protracted war in Ukraine is certainly a dampener. Now, what does it tell us about the bifurcation in the global system? While the war in Ukraine is indeed an inflection point for the bifurcation of the geopolitical world order between, say, democratic and autocratic statecraft, that bifurcation is yet to be seen in the enmeshed economic interests of the major players. In other words, the geo-economic bifurcation and decoupling might follow the footsteps of geopolitical bifurcation as trade transcends the era of free market efficiency and cowboy capitalism and inches towards trusted connections with resilient economic structures and perhaps a new energy map as well. It could be the beginning of the end of how neoliberal principles have guided global trade. But as we stand today in the second year of the war, it is still a far cry. Looking beyond Europe, it is not China's recent and ill-designed courting of anxious Europeans, but its deft posturing within the developing world that also merits attention. Where China actually succeeds is in a clever projection of itself as a part of the developing world and especially as a partner to the global south. And New Delhi needs to watch out for this. The Ukraine war has unleashed a truly intersectional global moment for India's statecraft. Remaining neutral has given India the credibility to emerge as the voice of the global south, harnessing its international posturing as a long-standing democracy rooted in non-alignment. At the same time, the country is deepening and expanding its spectrum of cooperation with the West. And that said, India also remains Russia's traditional friend and partner. But China's engulfing influence on Russia will decide how much India can depend on Russia in the longer run. As the war stretches on, India should explore the emerging channels of strategic cooperation, drawing on its expanding geopolitical outreach and footprint. That would be a far more potent way to restore balance in the Asian regional order. The link to my article with many more references is given in the description box. As Noah Barkin said, and I quote, China can't win the three-dimensional diplomatic chess game of bashing the US, wooing Europe, and standing by China. But where does India fit in all this? I'll be back to discuss that and more. Stay tuned.